everyone. Welcome to our briefing. This topic will be presented by Michael Bainey. Michael is the Intelligence Manager for the Americas. He graduated from American University, where he earned his master's degree in international relations. Michael's going to brief on the growing unrest in Chile and other South American countries and possible scenarios for the coming year. Michael?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Mary. So in this portion of the webinar, I'm just going to be talking about our forecast for Latin America for 2021, largely using Chile as an example of the issues that the region faces. And I think to look at where Latin America is headed in 2021, we first have to look back a bit, not just to 2020, which was obviously an incredibly unusual year across the world, but also to 2019. And 2019 was, in some ways, a seminal year for Latin America, and not necessarily in a good way. The economies of many Latin American countries began to significantly slow down in 2019, and Brazil's seemingly never-ending Lava Jato corruption scandal metastasized across the region, causing significant instability in other countries. And those factors led to growing discontent across the region that still exists today. Of course, one of the biggest stories from the region in 2019 was a manifestation of that discontent, the protests in Chile. And I think these protests provide a good case study for people looking at the region as a whole, because their dynamics have been repeated across Latin America through 2020 and will likely pose an issue in 2021. So just as a quick background, the protests began in October 2019 over a very modest increase in the fare of the Santiago Metro. And at first, they were peaceful and not particularly disruptive. However, they quickly started to become more confrontational, with students blocking trains, vandalizing metro stations, and confronting police. These demonstrations radically changed after a police officer shot a young protester at one of the demonstrations. And that occurred on October 18th. And if you go back and look at any timeline of protests, you'll see that they immediately became more widespread and violent that day going forward. Videos of the shooting were spread across social media, and in response to them, there was significant rioting that night, and the police used tremendous force to disperse the demonstrations, which spurred yet further protest. And this has become a theme in Chile that we've seen across Latin America and that we are likely to see going forward in 2021 as well. When the police respond to protests using overwhelming force, videos of it begin to circulate on social media and ultimately the broadcast news media, and those videos spark further protests. Of course, it wasn't just some police officers, but also some of the demonstrators who acted violently. In fact, there was significant violence and criminality in some of the demonstrations. Many of the metro stations in Santiago were completely destroyed by rioters. There was wide-scale looting of stores throughout the country, especially in Santiago, and many businesses became the victims of arson attacks. And ultimately, as the demands of protesters shifted from a reduction in metro fares to the implementation of an entirely new constitution, the government agreed to hold a plebiscite on whether or not to draft a new constitution. And that concession caused protest activity to dramatically decrease at the end of 2019. And this sort of brings us to where we are now, with an unsteady peace that could be broken at any time. I think a lot of people have forgotten that the protests, including rioting, actually, began anew in March 2020. And in normal circumstances, it would have persisted for some time. However, the protests came to a halt in mid-March. And I think one of the key things to consider when thinking about 2021 is this. The protests didn't end because the situation improved or the protesters' demands were met. They ended only because the pandemic arrived in Chile in mid-March and the government imposed harsh measures that effectively confined people in their homes. So not only has the situation not gotten better, it's actually gotten worse. People are poorer because the pandemic has created a recession, and the failure of the government to contain the spread of the virus is likely to further erode public trust in the government. These are dynamics that are true elsewhere in the region as well. Latin America has seen major declines in GDP across the region and has had some of the highest death rates from COVID-19 due to the underdeveloped healthcare systems in the region. And Latin American countries have also thus far failed to rapidly deploy the vaccine. And in some cases actually have not even begun to deploy the vaccine, and that may lead to further discontent. And as a result, we expect that renewed protests are likely in 2021. In effect, the upheaval of 2019 was frozen by the pandemic, but the ice is beginning to thaw and these conflicts are beginning to get unfrozen in 2021. And unrest could come from a variety of issues. In Chile, the plebiscite on whether or not to write a new constitution that had been offered by the government as a way out of the crisis was held, and the voters chose to approve of the measure in a landslide. And while there's overwhelming support for a new constitution, however, there's very little consensus on what the new constitution should look like, which may lead to discontent and unrest. Um, Notably, critics of the current constitution frequently point out that the document was written for and by a dictatorial regime. And that's true, but it's also the case that the constitution has been amended more than 40 times since democratization occurred in 1990, and nearly all of the amendments were aimed at making the government significantly more democratic. And as a result, I think there's a real danger that the Constitutional Convention will disappoint people by drafting a constitution that is very similar to the current document, only with the democratic provisions of it in the main text of the document rather than in amendments. And if that happens, many people, especially those on the political left, will likely reject the new constitution as bringing only cosmetic change. However, if the Constitutional Convention goes in the opposite direction and does more to, you know, move to make really deep reforms, it's possible that those modifications will be so polarizing as to make it impossible for the convention to pass a new constitution. While the Constitutional Convention still has to be elected and set its own rules, it's very likely to require a two-thirds supermajority to pass any draft constitution, which would make it more difficult to actually get anything done than if a mere simple majority would suffice. And if the convention appears to be deadlocked, that could be a trigger for further protest. Chile's not the only country that experienced major protests in 2019 that could return in 2021. However, Ecuador also saw major protests and rioting in 2019, which were so severe that the entire upper echelon of the government temporarily left the capital, Quito, as a precaution. And there's a few reasons to think that unrest could return in 2021. While media outlets largely reported those protests as if they were solely about fuel subsidies, the cause of the demonstrations was actually significantly more complex than that and was largely tied to issues within Ecuadorian indigenous politics that have not yet been fully resolved. A lot of outlets also suggested that the left-wing former president, Rafael Correa, was behind the protest. And again, it's really not that simple. While Correa did support the protest, the indigenous groups that organized them have an extremely antagonistic relationship with him. And notably, Ecuador right now is just a week away from its presidential election. Andrés Arauz, the close ally of Correa, is leading in the polls. And I think it's important not to assume that just because he's a leftist and many of the indigenous protesters are leftist, there will be fewer protests and everyone will get along if he wins. Again, the indigenous protesters of 2019 did not like Correa at all, and they're not likely to get along with Arras if he's elected. Um, it's also worth pointing out that, as in Chile, protests in Ecuador became especially violent after videos surfaced of a protester being shot and killed by the police. And that's just a recurring theme. That theme was present in Colombia, for example, as well, where deadly protests occurred in September 2020. Those protests were sparked by a video of police officers kneeling on a man as they were arresting him, and that guy had actually been accused of violating the COVID restrictions. And the man ultimately died of asphyxiation. So again, it was just a viral video of police that prompted the protests. And I think it's important to point out another dynamic here, and that's of protesters being inspired by demonstrations in other countries. It certainly did not escape Colombian activists and protesters that the video of a police officer kneeling on a man who they had arrested until he died was strikingly similar to the death of George Floyd, which had just a few months earlier touched off major unrest in the United States. And protesters across the region are definitely taking cues from one another. It's not to say that that the conditions in each unique country don't matter. They do. And nor is it to say that there's, some kind of major international coordination between protest movements, but there is a degree of inspiration and copying of tactics that we can see. An example of this can be found in the recent demonstrations in Peru, which took place late last year. These demonstrations were extremely widespread and among the most impactful that the region saw. They effectively forced the complete collapse of the administration of President Manuel Merino just 3 days after he took office. And in fact, in a single week, Peru had 3 presidents in one day on which no one was the president, largely as a result of that unrest. And the constitutional crisis that sparked the protest was quite complicated, so I'm not going to get into it here, but it was uniquely Peruvian. Nevertheless, the protesters were clearly inspired by what had happened in Chile. In fact, I can tell you I was recently on a conference call with a Peruvian congresswoman who was quite openly supportive of the protests. And she said something like, we learned how to do all this by watching Chile. And then she actually paused and corrected herself, saying, well, that thing of neutralizing tear gas canisters by putting a traffic cone over them and pouring water on them, that we got from watching the protests in Hong Kong. And so I thought that was an interesting comment, and I think it's where we're headed with activists paying attention to what's going on in other countries and copying what they think looks successful. In fact, even watching the protests in Peru, even before I heard the congresswoman say that, it was really striking to me how much both the police and the protesters were copying from Chile. I've seen a lot of protests in Peru. I used to live in Lima, and in fact, I lived right on the one of the plazas in which most of the protests occur in Lima. So I've seen them 100 times. But the most recent bout of arrest, everything from in that most recent bout of arrest, everything from the shotguns that the police were carrying to the willingness to use them to the way the protesters would kind of gang up on officers separated from the police line and use that to push the police back, struck me as looking much more like the 2019 Chile protests than anything I'd seen in Lima before. And in Peru, too, continued unrest is possible. While that constitutional crisis is over, elections will be held in 2021. And the root of Peru's continued instability is public exhaustion with the corruption scandals that have plagued the country for years. People want a president and a Congress that will just eradicate corruption immediately, and it's not at all clear that they're going to get that. And meanwhile, improvements into Peru's substandard public services will likely have to be delayed due to fiscal constraints caused by the economic downturn, which could fuel even further resentment. So to summarize, I think there are a few things to watch for in 2021. First, the unrest of 2019, which had effectively been suspended by the pandemic in 2020, may return as the conditions that sparked the unrest are no better. Second, the economic conditions that drove some of the unrest throughout the region have actually worsened as a result of the pandemic, with many of Latin America's poor pushed into truly dire straits. And due to the economic decline, governments just simply don't have the fiscal ability to do much to help these people, which could create further discontent. Third, the response to the pandemic has left a lot to be desired. The governments in the region have, for the most part, failed badly at containing the spread and are slow in deploying the vaccine. And additionally, restrictions on movement and travel are becoming increasingly unpopular, and these issues could spark unrest. Fourth, we've seen repeated instances in which the police use of force against protesters has completely backfired and caused the protests to get bigger and more violent. Recent protests in the region have largely been less older union members and more, young people who are well connected on social media and apps like WhatsApp, and so videos of police using force have rapidly spread among them, and further uses of force could prompt more demonstrations. And finally, protesters are taking their cues from similar movements in other countries. And we should keep in mind that, demonstrations in one country may lead to demonstrations in another. And even when they don't lead to demonstrations in another, protest tactics that are used in one country may appear in another.